Sarah Martinez never imagined that marrying for love would feel like a prison sentence. At 26, she found herself living in the sprawling Whitmore estate, a testament to old money and older grudges, where every marble floor she walked on seemed to whisper that she didn't belong. Her husband James had inherited the mansion from his late father, along with two stepsisters who treated the place like their personal kingdom. Madison and Chelsea Whitmore had made it abundantly clear from day one that Sarah's presence was nothing more than an inconvenience they'd have to endure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the grand windows of the Whitmore dining room as Sarah quietly prepared breakfast for the household. Her bare feet moved silently across the cold kitchen tiles, a habit she'd developed to avoid waking anyone too early. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, as the lady of the house, was the one doing the cooking while her stepsisters slept until noon in their silk pajamas. Madison, the older of the two at 31, had perfected the art of looking down her nose at people, despite being barely 5'4". Her blonde hair was always styled to perfection, and her wardrobe consisted entirely of designer pieces that cost more than most people's monthly salary. She had a way of making every conversation feel like a job interview Sarah was failing. Chelsea, 29 and equally blonde, was Madison's shadow in every way that mattered. Where Madison was calculating, Chelsea was petty. Where Madison delivered cutting remarks with surgical precision, Chelsea preferred the blunt instrument approach. Together, they formed a two-person army dedicated to making Sarah's life miserable. The arrangement had started innocently enough. When James traveled for business, which happened frequently given his role as CEO of Whitmore Industries, his stepsisters had offered to keep Sarah company. What Sarah hadn't realized was that their definition of companionship involved treating her like unpaid household staff. It began with small requests. Could Sarah pick up Madison's dry cleaning since she was going into town anyway? Would Sarah mind preparing lunch since Chelsea had a nail appointment? Could Sarah handle the grocery shopping because the stepsisters were far too busy with their charity committee meetings? Each request came wrapped in false sweetness and sisterly concern. "We just want to help you feel useful," Madison would say with that practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "After all, you must feel so out of place in a house like this. At least this way, you're contributing something." Sarah had grown up in a modest apartment with her single mother, who worked double shifts as a nurse to make ends meet. She understood the value of hard work and had never been afraid to get her hands dirty. What she hadn't expected was to find herself scrubbing toilets in her own home while her stepsisters lounged by the pool, critiquing her technique. The cleaning schedule had evolved gradually. First, it was just helping out when the regular housekeeper was sick. Then it became covering for her on weekends. Eventually, Madison announced that they were letting the cleaning staff go entirely. "It's so much more personal when family takes care of the house," she declared, though her definition of family clearly didn't include herself or Chelsea. Sarah found herself responsible for maintaining all 12 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, the grand dining room, the library, the conservatory, and the massive kitchen that looked like it belonged in a 5-star restaurant. The Whitmore estate sprawled across 4 acres, and every inch of it seemed designed to remind Sarah that she was an outsider looking in. The worst part wasn't the physical labor, though her hands had grown rough and her back ached constantly. It was the way Madison and Chelsea watched her work, making comments just loud enough for her to hear. "Look how natural she is at this," Chelsea would whisper to Madison as Sarah mopped the marble entryway. "I guess some people are just born to serve." Madison would nod thoughtfully, as if Sarah weren't standing right there. "It's probably better this way. She's finally found something she's good at." James always did have a soft spot for charity cases. They had a particular talent for timing their cruelest remarks for moments when Sarah was most vulnerable. When she was on her hands and knees scrubbing the bathroom floor, Madison would appear in the doorway to announce that she'd invited 12 people for dinner and expected everything to be perfect. When Sarah was already exhausted from a day of cleaning, Chelsea would dump a glass of red wine on the white carpet and apologize with exaggerated remorse. The stepsisters had their own twisted logic for every demand. "Sarah should clean Madison's bedroom because you're so much better at it than I am. Sarah should do Chelsea's laundry because you know how delicate my skin is, and I can't risk using the wrong detergent. Sarah should prepare all their meals because You have such a talent for simple, hearty food." Every compliment was an insult in disguise. Every request a reminder of Sarah's perceived place in the household hierarchy. They treated her like a servant who happened to share their last name, and they did it all with smiles that could have graced magazine covers. James remained blissfully unaware of the situation. His stepsisters were careful to maintain their sweet, caring facade whenever he was around. They'd rush to help Sarah carry grocery bags when they heard his car in the driveway, then disappear the moment he left for another business trip. They'd praise Sarah's cooking at dinner parties, then complain about it being too plain or too spicy the moment James stepped out of the room. Sarah had tried to tell him about their behavior, but her attempts always came across as petty complaints. "Madison asked me to reorganize her closet." Sounded reasonable until Sarah tried to explain that it involved 3 hours of color-coding designer dresses while Madison sat nearby, pointing out everything Sarah was doing wrong. Chelsea spilled something in the kitchen seemed minor, until Sarah tried to convey that it happened every single day, always when Sarah had just finished cleaning. James would listen with the patient expression of a man trying to understand female dynamics that were beyond his comprehension. "They're probably just trying to help you feel included," he'd say, pulling Sarah into his arms. "I know it's an adjustment, living in such a big house with people you barely know. Give them time. They'll come around." But time only made things worse. As the months passed, Madison and Chelsea grew bolder in their demands and more creative in their cruelty. They began hosting elaborate dinner parties without telling James, then presenting him with the bills for catering and flowers while praising Sarah's hard work in preparing everything. They'd schedule spa days and shopping trips for themselves while assigning Sarah increasingly impossible tasks. The breaking point should have been the day Madison decided the entire house needed to be spring cleaned in preparation for their mother's annual visit. Sarah spent 2 weeks washing windows, polishing silver, and reorganizing closets, while the stepsisters supervised from their positions on various pieces of antique furniture. When their mother arrived and complimented the cleanliness of the house, Madison and Chelsea accepted the praise without mentioning Sarah's role. Or perhaps it should have been the evening Chelsea decided to redecorate her bedroom and had Sarah move furniture until 3 in the morning, only to change her mind and demand everything be moved back the next day. "I'm just so indecisive," Chelsea had giggled to Madison. "Thank goodness Sarah is here to help me figure things out." But Sarah endured it all with the quiet dignity her mother had taught her. She bit her tongue when Madison criticized her cleaning techniques. She smiled politely when Chelsea complained that the food was never quite right. She continued to love James despite his inability to see what was happening in his own home. The stepsisters had miscalculated one crucial factor, however. They assumed that Sarah's quiet nature meant she was weak, that her willingness to work meant she was desperate, that her love for James meant she would accept any treatment to stay in his life. They saw her calloused hands and tired eyes and concluded that they had successfully broken her spirit. What they didn't see was the strength that had been forged in that modest apartment, where Sarah had learned that love meant sacrifice, but it didn't mean accepting abuse. They didn't recognize the quiet fury that built each time they dismissed her contributions or mocked her background. They couldn't comprehend that Sarah's silence wasn't submission, but rather the calm before a storm they had no idea was coming. The final confrontation began on a Tuesday morning when Madison announced that she was hosting a charity luncheon for 50 of the city's most prominent women. "It's for the children's hospital," she explained to Sarah with that familiar, condescending tone. "Very important people will be here, so everything needs to be absolutely perfect. I'm sure you understand." Sarah understood perfectly. She understood that she would be expected to prepare a 5-course meal for 50 people. She understood that she would be responsible for setting up the grand dining room, polishing the silver, arranging the flowers, and serving the food. She understood that Madison and Chelsea would take all the credit while she remained invisible in the background. What Madison didn't understand was that this luncheon would be the last time she would be able to treat Sarah like her personal servant. The storm that had been building for months was finally ready to break, and when it did, it would wash away every assumption the Whitmore stepsisters had made about the quiet woman they had so severely underestimated. The morning of the luncheon dawned bright and clear, and Sarah rose before sunrise to begin preparations that would change everything. She had no idea that by evening, the balance of power in the Whitmore house would be forever altered. or that her husband would reveal truths that would leave Madison and Chelsea questioning everything they thought they knew about the woman they had spent months treating as their personal cleaning lady. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As Sarah tied her hair back and began the work that would ultimately lead to her vindication, she couldn't have imagined that this day would become the turning point that transformed her from victim to victor, or that the stepsisters who had made her life a misery were about to discover just how dangerous it could be to underestimate someone with nothing left to lose. The charity luncheon was in full swing when disaster struck. Sarah had spent the entire morning preparing an elaborate spread that would have impressed the finest restaurants in the city. The grand dining room gleamed under crystal chandeliers, 50 place settings arranged with military precision across 3 interconnected tables draped in cream silk. Madison held court at the head table, wearing a powder blue dress that cost more than most people's cars, regaling the mayor's wife with stories about her philanthropic efforts. Chelsea fluttered between groups like a social butterfly, her diamond earrings catching the light as she discussed her latest shopping trip to Paris. Sarah moved through the room like a ghost, refilling water glasses and ensuring each course arrived at the perfect temperature. The wealthy women barely acknowledged her presence, treating her like part of the furniture. She had grown accustomed to being invisible at these events, but today something felt different. Mrs. Richardson, the hospital board chairwoman, raised her crystal glass for attention. The room fell silent as 50 pairs of eyes turned toward Madison. "I'd like to thank our hostess for this magnificent event. Madison, your dedication to the Children's Hospital is truly inspiring. This luncheon alone will fund an entire wing." Madison stood gracefully, her smile radiant as she accepted the applause. "I'm just grateful I can contribute to such a worthy cause. Every child deserves the best medical care, and I believe those of us who have been blessed with abundance should share that blessing." The women nodded approvingly, their admiration evident. Sarah continued clearing plates, her movements mechanical as she listened to Madison accept praise for work Sarah had done, for money Sarah had never seen, for generosity that existed only in Madison's carefully crafted image. "Tell us about the menu," called Mrs. Pemberton from the middle table. "Everything has been absolutely exquisite. You must share your secrets." Madison's laugh tinkled like wind chimes. "Oh, I can't take credit for the cooking. Our Sarah is wonderfully talented in the kitchen. She's been such a blessing to our family." The condescension in her tone made Sarah's jaw clench. Even when giving credit, Madison managed to make it sound like charity. Several women glanced at Sarah with polite smiles before returning their attention to Madison, who was already launching into another story about her humanitarian efforts. Sarah excused herself to the kitchen, needing a moment away from the performance. She stood at the sink, her hands gripping the marble counter as she fought back tears of frustration. 6 months of this treatment, 6 months of being treated like hired help in her own home, and still James saw nothing wrong. The sound of footsteps made her turn. Chelsea entered the kitchen, her expression darker than usual. "We need more champagne upstairs." "The Hartwell woman has already finished 3 glasses." Sarah nodded, reaching for the bottle she'd prepared earlier. As she lifted it, Chelsea suddenly stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You know they're all laughing at you, right? Poor little Sarah, playing servant to the real ladies of the house." "I'm not playing anything," Sarah replied quietly, not looking up. Chelsea's laugh was sharp. "Of course you are. You think because you married James that makes you one of us? Look around, Sarah. You're serving drinks while we're raising money for charity. You're cleaning up while we're making connections that matter. Face it, you're exactly where you belong." The champagne bottle slipped from Sarah's hands, shattering against the marble floor in an explosion of glass and golden liquid. The crash echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. Chelsea jumped back, her designer shoes narrowly avoiding the spreading mess. "Look what you've done! Those women will think we can't even manage our own staff properly." "I'm not your staff," Sarah said, her voice barely controlled. "Could have fooled me," Chelsea shot back. "Clean this up before someone gets hurt. And find more champagne. The Richardsons are major donors, and we can't disappoint them." Sarah stared at the broken glass scattered across her kitchen floor, something inside her finally snapping. 6 months of being treated like a servant in her own home. 6 months of watching her stepsisters take credit for her work. 6 months of James being too blind to see what was happening right under his nose. She walked past Chelsea without a word, her bare feet careful around the glass shards. The older woman called after her, but Sarah was already pushing through the swinging doors into the dining room. The conversations continued around her as she moved through the tables, past the women who had ignored her all afternoon. Madison was still holding court, describing her latest charity project with animated gestures. She looked up as Sarah approached, her smile faltering slightly at whatever she saw in Sarah's expression. "Ladies," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the gentle chatter like a blade. 50 faces turned toward her, expressions ranging from surprised to annoyed at the interruption. Madison's eyes widened in alarm. "Sarah, is everything all right? Perhaps you should return to the kitchen. I think it's time everyone knew the truth about this charity luncheon," Sarah continued, ignoring Madison's attempt to dismiss her. "About who really organized it, who really cooked this meal, and who's actually donating the money." The room fell completely silent. Madison's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Sarah, you're obviously upset about something. Why don't we discuss this privately?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "I think these generous donors deserve to know where their contributions are really coming from." Mrs. Richardson leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. "What do you mean, dear?" Sarah turned to face the hospital board chairwoman directly. "I mean that Madison Whitmore hasn't donated a single penny to your hospital. Every check that's been written, every contribution that's been made in the Whitmore name has come from my personal trust fund." The gasps that rippled through the room were audible. Madison shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "That's ridiculous. Sarah, you're obviously having some sort of breakdown." "Am I?" Sarah reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her phone, scrolling to her banking app. "Mrs. Richardson, would you like to see the transaction history? Every donation to the Children's Hospital, the Literacy Program, the Women's Shelter, all of them came from my account, all of them signed off on by Madison and Chelsea, as if the money were theirs." Mrs. Richardson's expression had shifted from confusion to something much sharper. As a hospital administrator, she was well versed in tracking donations and had seen her share of charity fraud. "May I see those records?" Madison lunged forward, trying to grab the phone. "This is insane. Sarah has been under tremendous stress lately. She doesn't know what she's saying." But Sarah was already handing the phone to Mrs. Richardson, who studied the screen with the intensity of an auditor. Her expression grew darker with each scroll through the transaction history. "These donations," she said slowly, "they're all from Sarah Martinez's personal account. The same donations that were credited to Madison and Chelsea Whitmore in our records." The murmur that went through the room was like the rumble of distant thunder. 50 of the city's most influential women suddenly found themselves witnesses to what appeared to be charity fraud of the highest order. Chelsea appeared in the doorway, having heard the commotion from the kitchen. She took one look at the scene and immediately went on the attack. "Sarah, what are you doing?" "These women are our guests. This is completely inappropriate." "What's inappropriate?" Sarah said, turning to face her. "Is you and your sister taking credit for my charitable giving while treating me like your personal maid." Mrs. Pemberton, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Are you saying that Madison and Chelsea have been accepting recognition for donations they didn't make?" "I'm saying that for the past 6 months I've been writing checks for every charity event, every fundraiser, every cause that Madison and Chelsea have claimed to support. Meanwhile, they've had me cooking, cleaning, and serving at these events like hired help." The room erupted in shocked conversation. These were women who understood social hierarchies better than anyone, and the implications of what Sarah was saying were staggering. If true, it meant they had all been deceived, that the charity work they had praised was built on lies. Madison's composure finally cracked completely. "You're nothing!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "You're a nobody from nowhere who got lucky when James took pity on you." Everything you have, everything you are, is because my stepbrother felt sorry for some poor girl from the wrong side of town." The words hung in the air like poison, and Sarah felt something inside her chest break open. Not from pain, but from relief. Finally, Madison had shown these women who she really was, beneath the designer clothes and charitable facade. "Is that what you really think?" Sarah asked quietly. "It's what I know," Madison snarled. "You're trailer trash who hit the lottery when James married you. The only reason you have money to throw around is because you managed to trick him into putting your name on his accounts." Mrs. Richardson cleared her throat loudly. "I think there's been a misunderstanding here. Sarah, did you say this money came from your personal trust fund?" Sarah nodded. "The Martinez family trust. It's been in my family for 3 generations." The silence that followed was deafening. Every woman in that room knew the Martinez name. It was old California money, the kind that built railroads and funded universities. The kind of money that didn't need to marry for security because it had been secure for over a century. Mrs. Richardson's voice was carefully controlled when she spoke again. "The Martinez family trust, as in Martinez Industries? The shipping empire?" "My grandfather's company, yes." Madison looked like she had been slapped. "That's impossible. You grew up poor. You lived in some tiny apartment." "I lived modestly because my parents wanted me to understand the value of money and hard work," Sarah replied. "The trust fund was always there, but I wasn't supposed to access it until I turned 25 or got married, whichever came first." The pieces were falling into place for the women in the room, but Madison and Chelsea still looked stunned. Chelsea found her voice first. "But you clean our house, you cook our meals, you do our laundry." "Because you told me it was what family did for each other," Sarah said simply. "Because I wanted to fit in and be accepted. Because I thought if I worked hard enough and proved myself useful enough, you might actually treat me like James's wife instead of like your personal servant." Mrs. Pemberton stood up slowly, her expression grave. "Ladies, I think we need to leave these people to sort out their family matters privately." But before anyone could move, the sound of a car door slamming echoed through the house. Heavy footsteps crossed the marble entryway, growing closer with each second. James Whitmore appeared in the dining room doorway, still wearing his business suit from the emergency board meeting that had cut his trip short. His eyes swept over the scene. 50 shocked women, his wife standing in the center with tears on her cheeks, and his stepsisters looking like they'd seen a ghost. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms full of powerful executives. Mrs. Richardson stepped forward, her expression grim. "Mr. Whitmore, I think you need to know what's been happening in your home." What happened next would become legend in their social circle, a story told and retold at dinner parties for years to come. But for Sarah, standing in that room surrounded by broken crystal and shattered illusions, it felt like the first breath of air she'd taken in months. James listened as Mrs. Richardson explained what she'd witnessed, his expression growing darker with each detail. He looked at the phone still displaying Sarah's banking records, at the faces of 50 women who had seen his stepsister's true nature, at his wife standing dignified despite everything she'd endured. When Mrs. Richardson finished speaking, James turned to Madison and Chelsea with an expression that made both women step backward. "Pack your things," he said quietly. "You have 1 hour to get out of my house." "James, you don't understand," Madison started, but he cut her off with a gesture. "I understand perfectly. You've been stealing from my wife, lying to these women, and treating Sarah like a servant in her own home. You're no longer welcome here." The authority in his voice brooked no argument. These were the same tones he used to fire executives and close billion-dollar deals. Madison and Chelsea knew better than to push him when he spoke like that. As the stepsisters fled upstairs to pack, James turned to address the room full of witnesses. "Ladies, I apologize that you had to see this. My wife's generosity has been taken advantage of, and I take full responsibility for not seeing it sooner." Mrs. Richardson nodded respectfully. "Your wife is a remarkable woman, Mr. Whitmore. The Children's Hospital has benefited tremendously from her support." After the guests had left and the stepsisters had been escorted from the property with their hastily packed bags, James and Sarah sat in their living room as the afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows. "I'm sorry," James said quietly, taking her hands in his. "I should have seen what they were doing to you." Sarah squeezed his fingers. "They were careful to hide it when you were around." "That makes it worse, not better," he replied. "You shouldn't have had to endure that in your own home." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, feeling truly relaxed for the first time in months. "It's over now." James pulled her closer. "It's more than over. I've already contacted my lawyer about pressing charges for the charity fraud. And I'm having their access to all family accounts permanently revoked." Outside, the Whitmore estate stretched across its manicured acres, looking exactly the same as it had that morning. But inside, everything had changed. The house that had felt like a prison was finally a home again, and Sarah Martinez Whitmore was no longer a servant in her own life. The stepsisters who had spent months treating her like hired help learned too late that respect cannot be demanded, only earned. And sometimes, the quiet person in the corner is not weak at all, but simply waiting for the right moment to remind everyone exactly who they're dealing with. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.